Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So it's time to review this rather nice Jian, or essentially Chinese straight sword, from Dynasty Forge. Now I have shown this sword fleetingly before, and I have done a video talking about my first impressions of Jian swords. I'm going to talk briefly about that before I get into this review. But this is the sky piercing sword. There's a link below this video to the listing of this sword where you can see where to buy it and how much it is and all of its vital statistics on the Dynasty Forge website. But I should mention that I am, as I have mentioned previously, I'm in no way an expert on Chinese swords, but I have owned a few antique examples in my life, and I have handled various others. But I'm not an expert on this particular type of sword, or in fact on any Chinese swords, but I do know some people who are experts, luckily, so I will hopefully in the relatively near future be doing some videos with one person who is one of the foremost authorities who I know of anyway on Chinese swords. Now, first of all, this is the sky piercing sword, as mentioned. According to the blurb on Dynasty Forge's website, this is modelled on a sword which was made for one of the emperors in China, and it is essentially a court sword. So this is where I'm going to link up with with the video I made previously, which I'll also link below here incidentally. And I think that was an interesting exercise in which I made certain observations and assumptions, guesses even, on the nature of the Chinese Jian, how it was maybe originally intended to be employed, and what its strengths and weaknesses were and things like this. Now, I fully accept all of the comments and feedback and extra information I've received since then. It does seem actually that some of my assumptions about the Chinese Jian were kind of wrong, okay? And I did make it clear in that video that I was doing some guesswork based on my experience with European and certain other types of Asian, for example Indian swords, which I do have more knowledge and experience on. Now, an interesting thing about the Jian, if I just unsheath it for a second, you'll see it's got a rather nice, relatively narrow, but not super narrow, not as narrow as a rapier, but maybe something along the lines of what we might commonly refer to as a side sword, which is a modern term, but some of you will know what I mean. So it's not as broad as something like most medieval European swords, but it is the same width, more or less, as lots of post-medieval European swords, so certain types of broadsword or side sword or things like this. It's wider than a spadroon, it's wider than a rapier. Now, I made certain assumptions about the use of this based on the design of the blade and the design of the hilt, and suggested that I think that these were maybe originally intended to be used with shields. Now, some certain people completely correctly pointed out that in fact the Jian was not used with shields predominantly, and it was predominantly used by civilians, kind of aristocracy essentially, courtiers, and it fulfilled in a way a bit of a role a little bit similar to things like small swords and rapiers. In other words, it was a civilian sidearm weapon that you carried around or wore, that was essentially a status symbol and occasionally was used for duels. And in war they primarily used the dao, or the big knife, essentially like a falchion or a saber. Now, I should mention on that I think that is not totally correct. Jians were sometimes used in war, and in fact the expert that I'll be talking with in future videos has confirmed to me that that is the case. There were some Jians that were made specifically for guards and militias and stuff like that to be used in warfare. However, there are complex reasons why that was the case, and by and large, by about the middle of the medieval period as it would be in Europe, so let's say by about the 15th or 16th century, the Jian by that time had become relegated pretty much mostly to a civilian sidearm for the aristocracy. So it was in some ways comparable to something like a rapier, and therefore not used with shields because people don't walk around wearing shields. However, its design, in my opinion, does hark back to earlier times. We know that the design of the Jian has its roots in earlier medieval, and in fact all the way back to the Bronze Age period swords, and there is some degree of continuity of design in certain elements of the sword, and those earlier swords, which were in fact short swords largely, were used with shields. So I think I was mostly wrong, but a little bit right in that sense. Right, on to the main review. So, as mentioned, the Jian is essentially a civilian sidearm that by this period, so we're talking about the kind of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the Jian was predominantly used by noblemen in civilian life to walk around with and wear as a symbol of their status and of their social rank. And to demonstrate their wealth with, and you should never underestimate that. Swords are in some senses jewellery in that they can demonstrate, as you can see with this, they can demonstrate decorative skill of the artisan who you've paid to make it, but also show your taste, say something about your, express your personal artistic preferences, but also of course to show your wealth. So if you use expensive things, gold for example, or jewels on the hilt, that does also demonstrate your wealth. But remember, taste was a thing just then as it is now, and covering something in rubies in some places, whilst it might demonstrate your wealth, might also demonstrate your very poor taste. So sometimes having something that's tastefully decorated as well as expensively decorated is, a difficult balance to get. Right, now let's have a look at Dynasty Forge's recreation. So, caveat, I should state that I don't know the original museum sword that this is based on, but it is allegedly based on a museum piece, but I don't have the statistics of that sword, and I don't know how close it is to the original. I'm just going to put the scabbard down for a second and focus on the sword. So first up, it is a straight, well-made, stiff, relatively thick blade. The total sword weighs under £2, so that is about 800 and something grams. So it's about the same weight as a military sabre, and it has some heft to it. When I wiggle the sword, so when I feel what its heft is like, it's got quite a bit of chopping force. And by trying to flex it, I'm doing this very carefully because it is very well sharpened, and I'll talk about the edge in a minute. It does have flex, as you can see. It is heat treated, spring tempered. But it's a relatively stiff blade. I think that's very interesting. That means that this point, whilst it doesn't look necessarily like a slender point like you might find on something like a rapier or a small sword, that point is nevertheless quite small and very pointy and very sharp with two edges there, two cutting edges, and stiffness greatly aids penetration. And regular viewers know about my views on penetration. You need a good degree of stiffness to get good deep penetration, and you will get it with this blade. This will be a fearsome thruster, and as I understand it, the methods of use for the Jian, which have survived in some sort of lineages, does use cuts and thrusts, but it is perhaps used thrusts more than something like the Dao, for example. So it is kind of a thrusting sword, but it does also cut, and you can feel that this is very much, I will perhaps at a later point show test cutting with this, but I can't do that now because the weather's too bad, incidentally, but it does have quite a lot of cutting authority up towards the end of the blade, and one of the advantages of having a slightly broader tip rather than something like a sort of small sword tip or something like that is you can cut further up the blade, which in real terms increases your reach. It means if you're chopping through something, in other words a person, an opponent, or any other target, tatami mat, you can do it closer to the tip, in other words from further away, which is a very real advantage actually. So the blade edges are basically parallel. There is no taper in this sense. Is there distal taper? Not a lot, okay, but I should point out not all swords have distal taper. I don't know whether the original of this has much distal taper, but this replica only has relatively minimal distal taper. Now what I can say is there are certain medieval European swords, particularly thrust-centric ones, so quite pointy ones, things like Type 17s and Type 15s, which often also don't have much distal taper because they taper in this direction, so they don't have to taper much in this direction. This sword doesn't really taper in either direction. That being said, it results in a stiff blade with a strong amount of cutting force. Should it have more distal taper? I'm not really sure. If there was more distal taper in the last third of the blade, or even the last half of the blade, it would make the sword more nimble, more quick. And I suspect that some people out there might prefer a blade that is a little bit more nimble than this. If you're not using this with the shield, you're not intending to cut through padded armor or any kind of armor, you are literally using this in a civilian dueling situation. It's not slow, but it's quite a hefty sword, and I have to say, I think that I would prefer something that was a little bit lighter at the tip if I was purely viewing this as a civilian self-defense weapon, something more akin to a spadroon or a short rapier, essentially. Right, in terms of the blade quality, well, as mentioned, I haven't cut with this, but the edges are good. These are better factory produced edges on it than I have got from most of the sharp swords I have bought. There is no secondary bevel. It is a direct single bevel from the midrib straight down to the edge, which I love. Okay, it is very nicely finished. If you look along the blade at a light, there are minimal or practically no real visible ripples. So cheaper quality blades, I won't mention makes, but the typical sort of lower end budget swords that you get, if you look along them, if they're heat treated and not ridiculously thick, if you look along them, they will generally have ripples in the finish. This is very nice and flat, very nicely finished. So you've got good edge geometry, good grinding. Now, the actual steel itself. So according to the website, and I can see that this is pattern welded, I doubt, I'll try and get it to focus on the blade for you. I don't know if it'll do it. I think it doesn't like it because it's too shiny. But you may or may not be able to see there are patterns in this steel. It is a pattern welded blade. And I have to say, when I first received this sword, I was a bit like, wow, that's pattern welded. That is really good for the price. Bearing in mind that this is from a reputable company, this isn't coming from one of the buyers who sell on Etsy and you don't really know where their stuff's made or what it's made of. This is a reputable company who presumably will stand by their products and their reputation, and if there's a problem they will deal with it responsibly. And this is made of 3 steels pattern welded together, forge welded together. If I recall correctly, they are 1095, 1085 and 1060. Each of those individually are good carbon steels, okay? So they are 3 good, pretty standard spec steels used in sword making, forge welded together and then lightly etched so that you can see the pattern. And the pattern is that more or less of the midrib has sort of circular patterns up it, and then either side of the midrib you have more or less straight, slightly wavy laminations. So it is an attractive blade, and it's not overly etched. Some pattern welded blades go kind of over the top in the etching and it goes too deep. This is actually quite a high in fact a very mirror polish, very high polish, lightly etched, so it's subtle and tasteful. I like it. In terms of the actual blade heat treatment, well, as I've shown you, it seems to, again carefully because it's quite sharply edged, it has got good flex to it. I'm only flexing it a little bit there. I have only cut very light things with this. I haven't properly test cut with this yet, okay? So that remains to be seen. In terms of the little mount here, I don't know what it's called in Chinese swords, but if it was a Japanese sword, this would be a habaki. And it's essentially a little brass mount or kind of sleeve that sits around the base of the blade and provides a larger shoulder for the guard to butt up against and prevents the hard steel of the blade eating into the softer metal like brass or gold or whatever it's made of the guard. So it forms essentially a kind of washer between the guard and the blade. That sits closely to the blade. It's well made. It's not overly fancy, but it seems to do the job. And as I say, it seats around the blade tightly. There's no movement there at all. The guard itself, so I think I can probably get the camera to focus on this. Now, I understand this will not be many people's taste, maybe. It's very ornate compared to a lot of the things that I normally show on this channel. But this is done by Lost Wax Casting. This is essentially some sort of copper alloy. I won't call it brass because I don't think it is exactly brass. It's probably got some tin and maybe zinc or something like that in it. So it's very crisply done. It's a very good casting. There are no major casting lines or flaws that I can see. It all appears to be solid. It has some weight to it, but it's not overly heavy. And I presume that that pattern, that design, is copied from the original. So it is what it is, you know, that is what the emperor of the day wanted on his court sword, and so that's what they've copied here. We've got the same pattern up here on the pommel. You'll notice there's a little bit of a rattle there. I'll talk about that in a minute. You've got the same thing on the pommel and the attached thing up here, and that's a matching, you know, it's the same metal, it's the same casting process. Right, now I'm going to talk about this cord going through here. Now obviously that's in emulation of the original silk cord. My feeling is that that actually cheapens the product slightly. It doesn't look, I don't know whether it is silk or not, but something about it to me doesn't look very classy, but that could just be to be my own prejudices, and actually the original one looks like that. So leave that one aside. Now, when this sword to me, so this is a minor negative point, when this sword came to me, the hilt was loose, okay? Now, if we look on the website, it says that the blade and the hilt construction is peened. I can verify that this one is not, okay? This sword, that is a screw nut at the end there. And I know because I took it apart and I experimented and I put it back on again and tightened it up. Now, there are drawbacks, there are positives and negatives to having a screwed nut at the end. One of the positives is you can dismount the hilt, you can do anything you want, you can tighten it up, you can change the grip, you can use the blade for a project, all sorts of things. It's very easy to take the sword apart. A disadvantage of screw nuts is, number one, if they fail, and screw nuts can fail because they can, you know, especially if that's brass, the steel of the thread can rip out the thread inside the brass, or they can get loose, or all sorts of other issues, okay? And sometimes you might find with swords that you use in practice, some of the swords I use have screw up nuts in the end, you do have to tighten them every now and again because the vibrations of using them does make them work loose. When I tightened that, and since I've tightened that, I don't have any major issues with the sword, but as you can hear, we do have some vibration. Now, I am not really sure where that vibration noise comes from, okay? It is somewhere inside the sword, and I'm not, if I hold the sword really tightly, you can hear there's still some vibration. Now it seems to be up at this pommel end. So I think that essentially the casting of the pommel to the tang is not as tight and snug as it should be, and as a result the only thing holding that really tight is the fact that I've screwed that nut up, rather tightened that nut up as tight as I can do with the smooth hemispherical part of a certain type of plier. So I haven't left any plier marks on there, but it is round, so you can't use anything like a spanner or a wrench on it. You have to use some kind of gripper, essentially, like pliers. In terms of the grip, and I'll talk about in the scabbard in a minute as well, the grip doesn't exactly meet up with the pommel, which is, I think, part and parcel of this same problem, that the inside of the casting of the pommel is perhaps a little bit big for the tang, or it just doesn't sit quite right with it. So the grip is very nicely made. It's some type of dark wood, I imagine hardwood, feels like a hardwood, and it's nicely done with this fluting. It's very nicely made, but it doesn't quite line up. If we're being super critical here, I'll just zoom in on that, it doesn't quite line up, so it overlaps slightly on one side and then doesn't quite come far enough, so it's slightly out of line with the guard and slightly out of line with the pommel. What that probably amounts to is the hole, hole, essentially, almost like a socket going through the pommel and through the guard, have a line which is in line with the tang, and when they drilled through the hole in the grip, it's very slightly offline with the pommel and the guard. That's something that I would like to see tightened up in this price range. This isn't an expensive sword. It's not in the top range or top tier of price of swords, but it's not a cheap sword either. And I think that fit and finish and the securing situation at the top with the nut really needs to be looked at a little bit more carefully. I think it needs a little bit more perfection. That being said, it is overall a nice sword. Now let's just look quickly at this scabbard. Really, I don't have an awful lot to say about the scabbard, apart from the fact that it is wood with fittings that are made of the same metal and fit the same decorative style and everything else as the hilt of the sword. The wood is thin and light, as it should be. It is not an overly bulky scabbard. This is a thinner scabbard than you'll be used to if you're used to katana scabbards. It is flatter. It's more like a medieval wooden scabbard in terms of its profile, and it's very nicely made. I mean, you can barely see the join. In fact, I can't. Oh yes, I can just about maybe see it. But the join between the two sides, because obviously the wood is made in two halves and then glued along, is very, very tight and very nicely done. The finish is nice and smooth. The fittings are good. They fit on the wood well. They seem to be secure. They don't move anywhere. All of the hanging apparatus is all there and ready to go, ready to attach to your belt. There are adjusters, so there's little buckles here, so you can adjust the angle at which the sword actually hangs. One minor criticism is the construction of these hangers actually have in the middle of each of these sort of two buttons in front of my two index fingers, or underneath my two index fingers, have holding the sling, as it were, there is a screw going through the face of each of those rosettes with a Phillips head on it. Now, I strongly suspect that the emperor in the 17th, 18th century did not have Phillips screw heads visible on the front of there. It's a shame. It lets it down, it lets the appearance down a bit, because there are copper rivets in other parts of the construction. So they've kind of done more traditional securing methods in other parts of the sword, but then it's let down slightly by the heads of these screws. They could have put a rivet through there and it would have looked so much more traditional, so much better. But apart from that, no real criticisms of the scabbard. In terms of the fit, the blade fits very snugly into the scabbard, and once it's in, there is no wiggle, no rattle at all, and the guard fits around the throat of the scabbard. So really there, to finish off, the Jian, very, very interesting model of sword. The sky-piercing Jian, link below again to Dynasty Forge's version of it. I have some issues which I've outlined in this video. I don't like the screws that we can see on the scabbard there. I don't like the fact that there's some vibration noise in the hilt, or indeed that there was a little bit of movement in the pommel when it arrived to me. Equally, I'm not completely convinced by the nut integrity or construction at the end, although I have to say it does go down the thread a fair way, and once tightened up, that is now not moving anywhere. Really, the highlight of this sword though for me, there are two actually, I'll be honest. The casting of the parts, of the copper alloy parts for the pommel, the guard and then the scabbard fittings is very crisp and very well done. I'm very impressed by the casting. It looks really good. But really the absolute highlight for me is the quality of the blade. The pattern welding looks good, it's subtly etched, the edge bevel is good, it's sharp, it's not overly heavy, it has a good total weight, the midrib is straight, it just seems to be a good blade. But caveat, as always, I haven't used the blade for very much yet, but I will do for some future videos. So that for now is the end of my review for the sky-piercing sword from Dynasty Forge. But of course this sword will feature in future videos, and I will use it for some stuff, and I will report back to you as this sword sees a little bit more use, and as I experience its pros and cons a little bit more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers folks!
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!